close your eyes, if you would like to, and let your body grow a little heavier against whatever surface holds you now, whether it is a mattress or a sofa, or the floor of a quiet room where the night has gathered softly around you. Let your breathing slow, just a little, as you breathe in and breathe out, and feel each exhale carry the small tensions of the day a little further from you, like leaves drifting downstream, unhurried and gentle. We are going to travel together tonight, you and I, very slowly, through time, through the long corridors of human history. And we are going to follow the quiet path of a very old illness, one that moved through civilizations without fanfare, without thunder, leaving behind only the still and particular traces that archaeologists and physicians and historians have spent generations piecing carefully together. It is the story of polio, known also as poliomyelitis, known also once, in a simpler and more sorrowful time, as infantile paralysis. And it is a story that winds through ancient Egypt and the crowded tenements of New York and the warm mineral waters of a small town in Georgia, and the laboratories of a young scientist in Pittsburgh who believed, with a quiet and steady certainty, that the world could be made safer than it was. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake enough to do so. And if you are already drifting, then simply drift, because the story will still be here, patient and unhurried, as it always has been. We begin, as so many stories begin, not with a discovery or a catastrophe, but with a carving in stone, with the quiet evidence of an ancient world going about its ancient life, unaware that the market left behind would one day be read by people standing in museum galleries under electric lights. Thousands of years later, there is a stele, a carved stone tablet, that dates to the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, somewhere between 1570 and 1342 before the Common Era, and upon this stone there is the figure of a priest, and his right leg is thin and shortened, and turned in a way that suggests, to modern eyes trained in the particular geometry of this disease, the telltale wasting that follows in the wake of a polio virus infection. The priest's name has not come down to us, but his image has, carved in the patient and enduring medium of limestone, and in that image there is the outline of something very old, something that was already ancient, when the pyramids at Giza were still being smoothed and finished, something that had found its way into human bodies long before anyone had any words for it was or why it came, or whether it would come again. It is worth pausing in the unhurried way that this hour and this darkness allow to consider what it means that polio is not a modern disease, not a consequence of industry or urbanization or the particular stresses of the 20th century, but something far older, something that moved through the ancient world as quietly and unremarkably as the seasons. Historians and physicians examining the mummy of the pharaoh Siptah, who belonged to the late 19th dynasty and lived and ruled somewhere between 1342 and 1197 before the Common Era, observed in his remains a similarly characteristic deformity of the left leg and foot, a deformity consistent in its angles and its proportions with what we now understand to be the legacy of paralytic poliomyelitis. The pharaoh Siptah ruled the most powerful nation of his age, commanded armies and temples, and the labor of thousands, and yet within his body there moved a small virus that no one in his court or in his medical priesthood could see or name or explain, a virus that had bent the bones of his leg in childhood and shaped, in some quiet and irreversible way, the manner in which he moved through his own life. And so we are not speaking tonight of a disease that arrived suddenly and departed, but of a companion that has walked beside humanity for as long as we have left carvings on stone and wrappings around our dead. Egyptian paintings from the period between approximately 1403 and 1365, before the Common Era, also depict children walking with sticks, their limbs altered in ways that speak, across the distance of millennia, to something familiar and enduring. The candles that burned in those Egyptian households, the soft, dry air of the Nile Delta, the prayers offered to gods, whose names are now spoken only in lecture halls. All of this surrounded those children, and none of it could touch the virus that had already done its quiet work inside them. We do not know how many there were, those ancient children with their sticks and their reshaped limbs, because the historical record keeps its own counsel and reveals only what has survived the long attrition of time. But the evidence that has survived is enough to tell us that polio was not new when it became epidemic, that it had been present in human populations for what may have been thousands of years, passing through communities without accumulating into the great devastating waves that would, much later, define it in the modern imagination. For most of those thousands of years, polio moved through the human world in a way that was, in a paradoxical sense, gentle, not because the disease itself was gentle, but because exposure to the polio virus in infancy, when it arrived reliably and early in life through contaminated water and the ordinary contact of communities living in close and unsanitary proximity, tended to produce mild illness or no illness at all, and left behind a quiet immunity that protected the body through all the years that followed. This is one of the more quietly ironic facts of the disease's history, and it is worth allowing it to settle for a moment before moving on. The very conditions that seem to us like poverty and privation, the open sewers and the shared wells, and the crowded households of the ancient and medieval world may have been, in their way, a kind of inadvertent protection against the worst that polio could offer, because they ensured that most children encountered the virus early, when their bodies were still shielded by the maternal antibodies passed to them at birth, when the encounter was likely to pass unmarked and unremarkable, and leave behind not paralysis but immunity. It was only later, much later, as sanitation improved and populations grew cleaner and more separated from one another, that the virus began to find larger numbers of individuals who had never met it before, who arrived at adolescence or adulthood without the quiet armoring of early exposure, and who were, therefore, far more vulnerable to the paralytic form of the disease when they finally encountered it. This pattern, this cruel reversal in which cleanliness and improvement created new and unexpected vulnerabilities, would not be understood for many decades, and even when it began to be understood, it would require still more decades and still more suffering before the full shape of the paradox became clear. But all of that belongs to later chapters of this story, to the late 19th century and the early 20th, to the era of reformers and public health campaigns and indoor plumbing, and we are not quite there yet. For now we are still in the long, slow, undifferentiated middle of human history, in the centuries when polio was present but mostly quiet, when it touched individual lives without accumulating into the collective catastrophes that would later make it one of the most feared words in the vocabulary of American parents. The Roman Empire rose and fell, and throughout those centuries, the virus continued its patient circulation, passing from person to person through the fecal-oral route that remains its only pathway of transmission, requiring no dramatic vector, no mosquito or flea or rat, only the ordinary and unavoidable business of human beings living alongside one another. And, inevitably, sharing more than they knew. It was not until the year 1789 that a physician gave what we now recognize as the first clear clinical description of the disease in Western medical literature, and that physician was an Englishman named Michael Underwood, a man who practiced in London and who had spent a great deal of his career attending to the illnesses of children, which in the 18th century constituted a particular and sorrowful category of medical concern. Underwood described the condition as a debility of the lower extremities, a phrase that is quiet and precise and carries within it the particular cadence of 18th century medical language, which tended toward the restrained and the observational, preferring to describe what the eye could see, rather than speculate about mechanisms that remained invisible and unknown. The debility Underwood described was characterized by weakness or paralysis, affecting the legs of young children, appearing without warning after what seemed, in most cases, to be a mild febrile illness, a fever that came and went and left behind, in certain unfortunate cases, a permanent alteration in the limbs, a stillness where movement had once been, a thinness where strength had once lived. Underwood was careful and observant, and he noted the pattern with the kind of measured attention that distinguishes the best clinical medicine in any era, and his description remained, for decades afterward, the primary text to which physicians turned when they encountered similar presentations in their own practices. The name poliomyelitis had not yet been coined, and would not be coined until later in the 19th century, when the German physician Rudolf Virchow and others began to examine the spinal cords of those who had died of the disease, and found there, in the grey matter of the anterior horn, the precise location where the virus does its particular work, the cellular damage that explained the paralysis, that gave it an anatomical home, and a name derived from the Greek words for grey and marrow, polios and myelos, combined with the suffix that indicated inflammation. It is the kind of naming that takes something frightening and gives it coordinates, places it within a system, and there is a particular quality of human comfort in that act, in the conversion of a terrifying mystery into a named and located thing, even when the naming does not yet come with a cure. Meanwhile, in the years and decades between Underwood's description and the formal naming of the disease, scattered physicians across Europe and America continued to encounter the same pattern, the same sudden weakness in the legs of children, the same brief fever followed by silence and stillness, and wrote about it in the case, reports and medical journals of their day, building, sentence by sentence and case by case, the slow and patient architecture of a clinical understanding. In 1840, a German orthopedic physician named Jakob Heine published what is widely regarded as the first comprehensive medical monograph on the disease, a text in which he described with particular care the clinical progression of the illness and the skeletal and muscular changes that followed in its wake, and his work was thorough enough and influential enough that the disease came, in certain European medical circles, to bear his name as part of what was called the Heine-Meeden disease. The second part of that name belonged to a Swedish pediatrician named Carl Oskar Medin, who worked in Stockholm at the end of the 19th century, and who had the particular misfortune, or perhaps the particular vantage point, of practicing medicine at the moment when polio began its transition from a sporadic and individual tragedy into something that could accumulate, that could gather itself into an epidemic, that could move through a community and claim many children in the same season, rather than one here, and one there, across a span of years. In 1887, Medin observed and documented an outbreak in Stockholm that affected 44 children, which was, by the standards of the time, a remarkable and alarming concentration of cases. A gathering of the disease that suggested something had changed, that the old patterns of sporadic and isolated occurrence were giving way to something larger and more organized, and, therefore, more visible and more frightening. Medin's meticulous clinical descriptions of this Stockholm outbreak laid an important foundation for understanding the range of presentations that polio could take, from the mild and transient to the severe and permanent, and his work helped to establish that this was a single disease with many faces, rather than a collection of unrelated conditions that merely resembled one another. The soft candlelight of 19th century clinics, the quiet scratch of a quill across the pages of case journals, the careful measurements of limb circumference, and the patient recording of temperature and pulse and reflexes, all of this was the work of men like Medin and Heine, doing what physicians have always done, which is to sit at the bedside of the suffering and try, through careful attention, to understand. And what they were beginning to understand, slowly and incompletely, but with increasing clarity, was that they were dealing with something that had its own logic, its own seasonal preferences, its own predilections for the young, its own capacity to arrive without warning, and to leave behind an altered life. The question of what, precisely, caused the disease, what invisible agent lay at the root of all these paralyzed limbs and abbreviated lives, remained unresolved until the first years of the 20th century, when a Viennese immunologist named Karl Landsteiner turned his considerable attention to the problem and, in doing so, transformed the entire subsequent history of the disease. Landsteiner was already a significant figure in medical science by 1908, best known for his work on blood groups, which had been published earlier in that same decade, and which would eventually, in 1930, earn him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, a recognition of the kind of meticulous and transformative work that tends to follow certain scientists through their entire careers and define the legacy they leave to the field. In the year 1908, working at the University Department of Pathological Anatomy in Vienna alongside his assistant, Erwin Popper, Landsteiner took the spinal cord tissue from a young boy of 9 years who had died of poliomyelitis after an illness of only 3 days, ground the tissue into a suspension, filtered it carefully to remove any bacteria, and injected the resulting filtrate into monkeys. The results were both decisive and, in the particular manner of good scientific work, surprisingly elegant. The monkeys developed paralysis, and when Landsteiner and Popper examined the spinal cords of those monkeys under the microscope, they found the same characteristic cellular damage, the same lesions in the grey matter of the anterior horn that they had seen in the tissue of the boy. On December 18th, 1908, at a meeting of the Royal and Imperial Association of Physicians in Vienna, Landsteiner presented his findings with the measured certainty of someone who had done the work and trusted the results, announcing to his colleagues that the cause of infantile paralysis was not a bacterium, as many had assumed, but a filterable agent, something so small that it passed through the finest filters known to science, something that could only be a virus. It was, in the understated atmosphere of that Viennese meeting hall, one of the more consequential moments in the history of infectious disease, a moment in which the invisible agent of a centuries-old affliction was identified and categorized and placed within the emerging framework of virology, which was itself a very young science, still accumulating its vocabulary and its methods, still learning to think about diseases caused not by the visible architecture of bacteria, but by entities so small they could only be inferred from their effects. The distant toll of a church bell might have sounded over Vienna that December evening as it had sounded over countless evenings before, and would sound over countless evenings to come. And the city continued its ordinary life, entirely unaware that in a laboratory somewhere within it, a door had been opened that would eventually, after much more suffering and much more work, lead to the abolition of a disease that had been present in human bodies since at least the age of the Egyptian pharaohs. The opening that Landsteiner had made in the understanding of polio was important and necessary, but understanding the nature of an adversary and knowing how to defeat it are very different things. And in the years that followed the 1908 Vienna announcement, the virus continued to do as it had always done, moving through populations according to its own patient logic, asking nothing of the world except the presence of susceptible hosts and the ordinary conditions of human contact. And the world, in the early decades of the 20th century, was providing it with something new. It was providing it with expanding cities and improving sanitation and growing numbers of children who had been raised in conditions clean enough that they had not encountered the virus in their earliest infancy and had not, therefore, acquired the quiet immunity that earlier generations had accumulated almost without knowing it. The stage was being set not through any failure of hygiene or any collapse of civilization, but almost through the opposite, through improvement and modernity, and the slow and genuine progress of public health, for something that had never happened before in quite the same way. A true epidemic of paralytic poliomyelitis, large enough to be unmistakable, concentrated enough to be catastrophic, visible enough to demand a response. That epidemic arrived in the summer of 1916, and it arrived with a particular and devastating directness in the borough of Brooklyn, in the city of New York, in the most populous and restless urban landscape in America. The summer of 1916 was warm, as New York summers are warm, and the neighborhoods of Brooklyn were dense and alive, with the ordinary traffic of immigrant life, the pushcart vendors and the fire escapes, and the children playing in the streets, in the particular freedom of the summer months. And it was among those children, in those streets, that the virus found its moment and began to move. In June of 1916, public health authorities issued a directive acknowledging the existence of an epidemic of polio in Brooklyn, and what followed over the remainder of that summer was a season of quiet sorrow that settled over the city like a held breath. By the end of the year, more than 27,000 cases had been reported across the country, and more than 6,000 people had died, with the great majority of those cases and those deaths concentrated in and around New York City. Families in Brooklyn and Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs watched their children with a new and particular anxiety that summer, watching for the signs of the illness, the initial fever and the stiffness, and the particular reluctance of the muscles to respond, and some of what they feared came to pass, and some of it did not, in the arbitrary and devastating way of epidemic disease, which makes no distinctions that the human mind can find satisfying or just. The public health response to the 1916 epidemic reflected both the genuine concern of the authorities and the limits of a medical understanding that had not yet arrived at any effective means of controlling the spread of a disease whose transmission routes were still being debated. Children under the age of 16 were prohibited in many areas from attending public gatherings, from visiting libraries, and theatres and public baths. And families were urged to keep their children at home and away from contact with other children, which was the kind of advice that was sensible in its general intention and difficult in its particular application, especially for families living in the cramped and communal conditions of immigrant tenement life, where privacy was a luxury and isolation was essentially impossible. There was, during this period, a particular and painful irony in the fact that the public health measures directed at the epidemic fell most heavily on the immigrant communities of the Lower East Side and Brooklyn, communities that were already subject to various forms of social scrutiny, and that found themselves, in the summer of 1916, subjected to a new layer of official attention that could feel more like suspicion than protection. Medical inspectors moved through the tenements, and families who had sick children were issued placards and instructions, and, in some cases, orders of quarantine. And the word polio took on, in those neighborhoods, a particular weight of dread and stigma that attached itself to the ordinary sounds and sights of summer, to the warmth of the air and the noise of the street and the playing of children, which now carried within them the possibility of something serious and irreversible. Meanwhile, in the wealthier neighborhoods and suburbs, families who had the means to do so fled the city for the summer, a response that was understandable and human, and that also, by distributing potentially infected individuals more widely through the surrounding regions, may have contributed to the geographic spread of the outbreak, though this was not fully understood at the time. Over the next several years, the 1916 epidemic receded, as epidemics do, leaving behind its damaged and altered lives and its changed landscape of public health policy, and the cities of America returned to the ordinary business of their ordinary days, though the fear of polio did not depart with the epidemic, but remained, banked like coals, ready to kindle again when the conditions were right. It is worth noting that the 1916 epidemic, devastating as it was, did not represent the end of large American polio outbreaks, but rather, in a sorrowful sense, a beginning, an inauguration of the era in which polio would return. Summer after summer, with varying intensity, building over the following decades into the recurring seasonal dread that would define it for a generation of American parents. The virus had found, in the cities of early 20th century America, a particular kind of environment that suited its expansion, populations large enough to sustain its circulation, sanitation improved enough that many children reached their susceptible years without prior exposure, and a density of contact in public spaces, swimming pools and schoolrooms and playgrounds that provided the pathways it needed to move from person to person. Between each summer of relative quiet and each summer of renewed outbreak, the virus did not disappear, but merely receded to its ordinary levels of background circulation, waiting, without intention or awareness, for the conditions that would allow it once more to accumulate into the visible and frightening phenomenon of epidemic disease. Physicians and public health officials during this period worked with what they had, which was clinical observation and epidemiological pattern recognition, and a deepening anxiety about the summer months when polio cases characteristically rose, which gave the disease one of its other informal names, the summer plague, a phrase that carries within it the particular dread of a season that should be associated with warmth and ease, and instead became, for many American families in the first half of the 20th century, a period of watchfulness and worry. The medical literature of these years accumulated steadily, each outbreak studied and written about, and added to the growing body of knowledge about the disease, its patterns of occurrence, its predilections, its clinical presentations, its aftermath. And through this accumulation, there developed, gradually, a community of researchers and physicians for whom polio was not merely a clinical curiosity, but an urgent and personal mission, a problem that demanded to be solved. Among the people who would eventually be shaped by this mission, one of the most consequential was a young man who was not, in the summer of 1921, yet a politician of national importance, but who would become, in part because of what happened to him that August, one of the defining figures of the 20th century, and whose particular encounter with the virus would transform not only his own life, but the entire subsequent trajectory of the fight against the disease he would come to embody. In August of 1921, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was 39 years old and had recently completed an unsuccessful run as the Democratic vice presidential candidate, traveled with his family to the island of Campobello, which lies off the coast of New Brunswick, Canada, in the cold and clear waters of the Bay of Fundy, a place where the Roosevelt family had summered for many years, and where the air was cool, and the landscape was open, and the life was, by the standards of a prominent political family, relatively quiet and uncomplicated. Roosevelt was, at this point in his life, a vigorous and physically active man, known for his athletic enthusiasm and his ease in the water, and Campobello was a place where those qualities found their natural expression in sailing and swimming and the general outdoor activity that the island afforded. What happened in those first weeks of August unfolded, as such things tend to unfold, without drama or announcement, beginning with a weariness that Roosevelt attributed initially to ordinary fatigue, a soreness in the back, and the legs that he assumed would pass with rest, as the small complaints of the body usually do, especially in a man accustomed to thinking of himself as healthy and strong. The fever came, and with it a stiffness and a weakness that were not the ordinary aftermath of exertion, but something else, something that deepened rather than resolving, that spread through his legs with a quiet and devastating thoroughness over the course of the days that followed. By the time the physicians who were called to Campobello had examined him and considered the clinical picture, the damage had been done, in the way that polio's damage is always done, not gradually and reversibly, but suddenly and permanently, in the days now, when the virus passes from the bloodstream into the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord and destroys the motor neurons that carry the signals of movement from the brain to the muscles of the lower body. Roosevelt would never again walk without the support of braces and assistance. And the life he had imagined for himself, the physical life of a vigorous man moving freely through the world, was altered in a single summer on a Canadian island in a way that no amount of determination or willpower or wealth could fully undo. And yet what followed from that alteration was not the end of the story, but, in certain ways, the beginning of a different and more consequential one, because Roosevelt's response to his diagnosis was not withdrawal or defeat, but a kind of slow and patient determination to inhabit his altered life as fully as the original one. And that determination would lead him, over the following years, to a small town in Georgia, and a warm spring, and a rehabilitation center, and eventually to the White House, and to the founding of an organization that would change the history of the disease that had changed his life. Roosevelt arrived in Warm Springs, Georgia, for the first time in October of 1924, having been directed there by his friend and financier, George Foster Peabody, who was among the co-owners of the property, and who had heard reports of a young man named Louis Josephs, who had experienced significant improvement In his condition through regular immersion in the warm mineral waters that flowed from the ground, there at a constant temperature of approximately 88 degrees Fahrenheit. The waters of warm springs had been known for their purported restorative properties for many decades before Roosevelt arrived. But it was Roosevelt's arrival and the attention and resources that followed in his wake that transformed the place from a modest and somewhat faded resort into something with a larger and more deliberate purpose. Roosevelt found in those waters a relief and a kind of freedom that he had not known since before his illness, because in the water, his damaged legs could move with a buoyancy and an ease that was impossible on land. And the warmth of the spring, which maintained its steady temperature through every season, created conditions in which the muscles he was working to restore could function with something approaching their former responsiveness. He returned to Warm Springs again and again over the following years, making 41 visits in total over the course of his lifetime. And in 1926, he invested a significant portion of his personal fortune to purchase the property and the land around it. And in 1927, he donated what he had purchased to a new organization called the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, which was devoted to the rehabilitation of polio patients, and which became, under the guidance of physicians and physical therapists, including Alice Lou Plastridge, who arrived in 1926 and remained for more than 20 years, a model for the field of physical rehabilitation throughout the country. The American Orthopedic Association, in 1927, recommended that Warm Springs be designated a permanent hydrotherapeutic center, a formal recognition of what Roosevelt and his collaborators had been building there, and the facility began to attract patients from across the country who came to the small Georgia town in the same spirit of hope and determination that had first brought its most famous children through its doors. There was, in Warm Springs during these years, a particular quality of community that arose among the patients, a shared understanding of what it meant to live in a body altered by polio, a collective refusal of the isolation and limitation that the disease might otherwise have imposed. And this quality, which Roosevelt himself embodied and encouraged, came to be known as the spirit of Warm Springs, a phrase that carried within it a belief, simple and sustaining, that a life shaped by polio could still be a full and meaningful and productive life. The soft sound of water, the warmth rising from the springs, the gentle rhythm of exercise in the pool, the voices of patients encouraging one another through the movements that their therapists prescribed. All of this constituted, in those years in the 1920s and into the 1930s, a small and significant world, a community built on a shared adversity and on the particular kind of hope that grows not from the denial of difficulty, but from the decision to move forward through it. The Georgia Warm Springs Foundation, which Roosevelt had established with such personal investment and such personal hope, existed in a particular and somewhat unusual relationship to the larger national crisis that polio was becoming, because while it served a vital function for the patients who came to its warm pools and its rehabilitation programs, it was ultimately a treatment facility rather than a research institution, a place concerned with managing the aftermath of the disease rather than with preventing it from occurring in the first place. Roosevelt understood this distinction, and he understood that the scale of what was needed, the kind of organized scientific effort that might eventually produce a vaccine or a cure, was far beyond what any single facility or any single philanthropist could accomplish alone. And so, in 1938, in the year that he was serving his second term as President of the United States, He joined with his law partner, Basil O'Connor, to transform the organizational infrastructure around Warm Springs into something larger, something with a national reach and a national mission, something that would invite the participation of ordinary Americans in the fight against a disease that had become, by the late 1930s, a source of widespread and genuine national anxiety. The organization they created was called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, and its founding on January 3, 1938 represented a moment in the history of public health funding that had few precedents, because what Roosevelt and O'Connor had understood with a clarity born partly from Roosevelt's own experience with the disease, and partly from their observations of how the American public responded to polio in ways that they did not respond to other illnesses, was that this particular disease had an unusual hold on the American imagination, an unusual capacity to generate sympathy and fear, and the desire to do something, anything that might help. The National Foundation's fundraising model was built around this understanding, and the mechanism it chose to harness the generosity of ordinary Americans was elegantly simple and remarkably effective. It asked people to send dimes directly to the White House, a single small coin from each of the millions of households across the country that had heard Roosevelt's voice on the radio and understood, in some personal way, what it meant to have the ordinary functioning of a body altered without warning or appeal. The radio entertainer Eddie Cantor, who was a popular and energetic figure in American broadcasting during this period, suggested the name for the campaign in January of 1938, calling it the March of Dimes, a play on the contemporary newsreel series called The March of Time, and the name proved to be as inspired as the mechanism, because it gave the campaign an identity and a momentum that carried it well beyond the initial appeal and established it as an annual tradition, a civic ritual of small generosity that bound millions of Americans to the work of research and rehabilitation that the foundation was doing. Within a few weeks of the first appeal, the White House had received 2.68 million dimes, an amount that amounted to $268,000, poured into mailbags and boxes, and delivered to an administration that had expected a generous response, but had perhaps not anticipated the sheer physical weight of so many small silver coins, the literal embodiment of a nation's collective concern. Over the following years, the March of Dimes would become one of the most successful public health fundraising campaigns in American history, generating the financial resources that would eventually support the work of researchers across the country and make possible the large-scale clinical trials that would test and prove the efficacy of the vaccine that was still, in 1938, many years and many scientific steps away from existence. The soft clink of coins dropping into collection boxes, the quiet transaction of a passed from a child's hand to a classroom envelope, the radio announcements and the posters and the small ceremonies of fundraising that took place in communities across America during these years. All of this constituted a particular kind of national conversation about illness and hope and collective responsibility. A conversation conducted not in the language of policy or science, but in the simpler and more immediate language of the small contribution, the gesture that said, in its modest and tangible way, that this matters, that we are in this together, that the suffering of children with whom we share a country is a concern that belongs to all of us, and not only to those directly affected. The epidemics of polio continued throughout the late 1930s and into the 1940s, returning each summer with the regularity that had come to define the disease in the American experience. Sometimes mild and sometimes severe, sometimes concentrated in a particular city or region, and sometimes more broadly distributed, but always present, always hovering at the edge of the warm months, with its particular and terrible unpredictability. During these years, the understanding of how the poliovirus moved through the body was deepening, and much of this deepening understanding was the work of researchers supported by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, who were beginning to map, with increasing precision, the journey that the virus made from its point of entry, which was the mouth and the digestive tract, through the bloodstream, and in a fraction of cases into the central nervous system, where it found and destroyed the motor neurons of the spinal cord's anterior horn, with a specificity that still strikes those who study it as remarkable, as if the virus had been designed for exactly this purpose. Though, of course, viruses are not designed for anything, but simply follow the logic of their own replication, with a thoroughness that makes design seem, in retrospect, like a reasonable metaphor. The question of how many distinct strains of poliovirus existed was one that occupied researchers for years and had significant practical implications for the development of any vaccine. Because a vaccine that protected against one strain would be useless against another, and it was only through careful and painstaking laboratory work, conducted across many institutions over many years, that the full picture of poliovirus diversity emerged. By the late 1940s, researchers working under the auspices of the National Foundation had established that there were three distinct types of poliovirus, classified as type 1, type 2, and type 3, each capable of causing paralytic disease, each requiring separate representation in any effective vaccine, a finding that clarified the scope of the challenge and set the parameters within which future vaccine developers would have to work. The most common and most virulent of the three types, the one responsible for the great majority of epidemic cases and of paralytic disease, was type 1, sometimes called Brunhilde, after the strain originally isolated from a chimpanzee, and it was this type that would be found again and again at the center of the major outbreaks that continued to mark the American summers of the 1940s. The methodology that researchers used during this period was demanding and slow, involving the inoculation of monkeys with viral preparations and the subsequent examination of their spinal cords, a process that required large numbers of animals and large amounts of laboratory space, and the kind of patient, repetitive, meticulous work that produces results measured in years rather than weeks, and that demands from the people doing it a particular combination of scientific rigor and personal endurance. The culture of the polio research community during these years was shaped, in no small part, by the resources and the expectations of the National Foundation, which was generous in its funding, but demanding in its orientation toward results, and which created, through the network of researchers and institutions it supported, a scientific community with a shared focus and a shared urgency that was unusual in academic medicine, where the pressure of epidemic disease was often less immediately felt. The distant sound of a summer thunderstorm, the particular quality of August light in the laboratories of American universities, the careful handwriting in the notebooks of graduate students, recording the results of another day's inoculations, all of this was the texture of the daily work from which the eventual triumph against polio would be built. Slowly and without drama, one experimental result at a time. It was within this research community, shaped by the resources of the March of Dimes and the urgency of the ongoing epidemic, that Jonas Salk first came to prominent attention, though his path to the specific problem of polio had begun somewhat earlier. and had been shaped by the particular direction of his scientific interests and his unusual willingness to pursue approaches that diverged from the consensus of his colleagues. Salk was born on October 28, 1914, in the Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant community of the East Bronx in New York City, the son of Ashkenazi Jewish parents, who had themselves immigrated from the Pale of Settlement in Poland and Russia, and who placed upon their children the particular and characteristic weight of expectation that immigrant families in that era and community directed toward education and professional achievement. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily able student from an early age, entering the City College of New York at 15 and completing his undergraduate studies there before gaining admission to the New York University School of Medicine, from which he received his medical degree in 1939. His interests, even as a medical student, were oriented more toward research than toward clinical practice, toward the laboratory rather than the bedside. And when he had the opportunity to take a year away from clinical training to work in the laboratory of a virologist named Thomas Francis Jr., he found there a direction and a methodology that would shape the next decades of his scientific life. The work with Francis was concerned with influenza, specifically with the development of a killed virus influenza vaccine, and in that work, Salk absorbed a set of technical skills and a set of scientific convictions that would prove directly relevant to his later work on polio, most importantly, the conviction that a killed virus vaccine, one that used inactivated viral particles rather than live attenuated ones, could produce robust and lasting immunity. A conviction that placed him at odds, in the years to come, with some of the most influential figures in the polio research community who believed that only a live virus vaccine could produce the kind of deep and durable protection that would be needed to defeat the disease. In 1947, Salk was appointed to the faculty of the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, where he would establish the laboratory and the team and the working environment in which the polio vaccine would eventually be developed, and where he would spend the better part of a decade in the patient and demanding work that such a project required. The Pittsburgh laboratory was not, by the standards of the great research universities of the East Coast, a particularly well-resourced or prestigious environment. But Salk brought to it an energy and an organizational intelligence that transformed it, over the years of his tenure, into a place capable of producing work of the first importance, supported by the generous and consistent funding of the National Foundation, which recognized in Salk a researcher of unusual promise and unusual commitment. The scientific problem that Salk faced as he turned his attention to polio in the late 1940s was not simple, and appreciating even its broad outlines requires a certain willingness to sit for a moment with the particular kind of complexity that belongs to virology and immunology, which are sciences that deal in the invisible and the submicroscopic, in particles and proteins, and the intricate molecular language through which the immune system recognizes and responds to foreign invaders. The core challenge was this: the body, when exposed to the polio virus, produces antibodies specific to that virus, proteins that circulate in the bloodstream, and that can, in sufficient quantities, intercept the virus before it reaches the motor neurons of the spinal cord and prevent the paralytic form of the disease from occurring. A vaccine, in its simplest conception, is a way of teaching the immune system to produce those antibodies before the natural virus arrives, by exposing the immune system to something that looks enough like the virus to trigger a response. But that cannot itself cause disease. The question that divided the polio research community in the late 1940s and early 1950s was how best to accomplish this teaching with a live attenuated virus, one that had been weakened through serial passage in laboratory conditions until it could no longer cause paralysis, but retained enough of its identity to generate immunity, or with a killed virus, one that had been inactivated through chemical treatment until it could not replicate at all, but whose surface proteins remained intact enough to be recognized by the immune system as something worth responding to. Albert Sabin, who was among the most eminent and vocal figures in the polio research community during this period, and who was working in Cincinnati on his own vaccine candidate, was a committed advocate of the live virus approach, and his advocacy was backed by both scientific argument and personal conviction. The scientific argument being that killed virus vaccines tended to produce weaker and shorter lasting immunity than live virus ones, and the personal conviction being that only a live virus vaccine would produce the kind of protection in the intestinal tract that would prevent not merely paralysis but transmission, and thus allow the vaccine to contribute to the eradication of the disease rather than merely to its management. Salk's position was different, and in some ways more cautious, rooted in his experience with the killed virus influenza vaccine and in his assessment of the particular risks of a live virus polio vaccine, which included the small but real possibility that an attenuated virus might, in some cases, regain its virulence and cause the disease it was intended to prevent, a risk that he considered unacceptable when a safer alternative might be available. The debate between these two approaches was conducted partly in the pages of scientific journals and partly in the corridors and meeting rooms of the scientific conferences where the leading researchers in the field gathered to present their work and argue their positions, and it was characterized by the kind of intensity and personal dimension that tends to develop in scientific disputes when the stakes are high and the personalities are strong, when the question under discussion is not merely an academic one, but a matter of which approach will be tested at scale, which will receive the resources and the support of the National Foundation, and which, therefore, will reach the children of America first. Alongside the scientific debate over vaccine strategy, the human reality of the polio epidemic continued to unfold through the late 1940s and early 1950s with a relentlessness that gave the debate its particular urgency. Because the summers were still coming, and the children were still falling ill, and the iron lungs were still filling up in the children's wards of hospitals across the country, and all of the scientific argument in all of the conference rooms in the world was hollow if it did not, eventually, produce something that could be put into the arms of children before the next summer arrived. The iron lung, the large metal cylindrical device that had been developed by Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw at Harvard University in 1927, and first used clinically in 1928, had by this period become one of the most recognizable and most unsettling symbols of the polio epidemic, a machine that stood in hospital wards like a row of metal coffins, each one enclosing the body of a patient whose respiratory muscles had been paralyzed by the virus, whose diaphragm and intercostal muscles no longer responded to the signals from the nervous system, and who therefore depended entirely on the rhythmic changes in air pressure generated by the machine's bellows mechanism to move air in and out of their lungs. The drinker respirator, as it was originally called, worked on the principle of negative pressure. The patient lay inside the metal cylinder, with only their head protruding, and the machine alternately decreased and increased the air pressure within the cylinder, causing the chest to expand when pressure decreased and to contract when pressure increased, mimicking in its mechanical way the action of the respiratory muscles that the virus had silenced. The first patient to be treated with the device, in October 1928 at the Children's Hospital in Boston, was an 8-year-old girl who had been present with severe respiratory paralysis following a polio infection, and she survived, which was not the outcome that had been expected, and her survival was the beginning of a medical story that would continue for decades. John Haven Emerson, a Boston engineer and medical device inventor who would later produce his own improved version of the iron lung at a fraction of the cost of the original drinker design, recalled many years afterward the particular atmosphere of the polio wards in the 1940s and 1950s, the rows of machines with their rhythmic cycling, the heads of patients protruding from the cylinders, the nurses moving among them, and the sound, which was the sound of many machines breathing in unison, a sound that those who heard it rarely forgot. The emotional weight of those wards, the quality of life experienced by patients who might spend months or years inside the machines, the courage required simply to exist within those circumstances, and to continue to hope for improvement, constitute one of the defining human realities of the polio era, a reality that was present behind all of the scientific debate and the fundraising, campaigns, and the political maneuvering, grounding all of that activity in the specific and irreducible fact of individual human suffering and human endurance. The summer of 1952 became, in the history of American polio, the worst single year of the epidemic, the summer in which the accumulation of cases reached a level that had never been reached before, and that gave the entire national conversation about polio a new and terrible urgency. In that year, more than 57,000 cases of polio were reported in the United States, the highest annual total ever recorded. And among those cases were nearly 22,000 individuals who were left with some degree of paralysis, and more than 3,000 who died. The hospitals of that summer, particularly the children's hospitals of the cities most severely affected, experienced a strain on resources and on personnel that is difficult to fully convey through statistics alone, because the numbers represent individual children and individual families and individual physicians and nurses who arrived for work each morning into wards that were full and remained full and filled further as the season progressed. The epidemic of 1952 struck in many parts of the country, but was particularly severe in certain regions, including the southeast, where the summer heat and the particular conditions of that year combined with the ongoing circulation of the virus to produce outbreak conditions of unusual severity. Among the most notable responses to the epidemic was the mobilization of the National Foundation's resources at a scale that reflected both the organizational capacity it had built over the preceding years and the particular horror of what was happening in the hospitals. A mobilization that included the shipping of iron lungs from cities where they were not urgently needed to cities where they were, the recruitment and training of additional physical therapists, and the channeling of research funds to the laboratories where the vaccine work was, progressing with a new and heightened sense of what was at stake. The year 1952 was also the year in which Jonas Salk and his team at the University of Pittsburgh made significant progress in the technical development of their killed virus vaccine candidate, progress that brought the prospect of clinical testing meaningfully closer. and that gave the researchers and the administrators of the National Foundation reason to believe that the worst of what they were enduring that summer might, within a few years, become something that belonged to the past rather than the present. The quiet confidence of Salk's laboratory work, the steady accumulation of experimental results, the careful refinement of the inactivation process that used formaldehyde to kill the virus while preserving the integrity of the surface proteins that the immune system would need to recognize. All of this was proceeding through the summer of 1952's worst weeks, with the patient rhythm of good science, indifferent to the urgency of the wards, but ultimately responsive to the need that those wards embodied. The process by which Salk's vaccine was prepared for the field trial that would test its efficacy on a mass scale involved several distinct and sequentially demanding steps, each of which had to be completed successfully before the next could begin, and each of which represented, in its own way, a significant technical and organizational challenge. The first challenge was the cultivation of sufficient quantities of the three types of poliovirus to produce a vaccine in the volumes that a large-scale trial would require. And this challenge was addressed, in part, through a technique developed at Harvard University by John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins, who in 1949 demonstrated that poliovirus could be grown in cultures of non-neural tissue, specifically in cultures of human embryonic intestinal and skin cells, a discovery that enormously simplified and expanded the possibilities for virus cultivation, and that earned its discoverers the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1954. Before the Enders-Weller-Robbins discovery, the cultivation of poliovirus had required the use of living nervous tissue, which was expensive, difficult to obtain in quantity, and raised the possibility that vaccine preparations might be contaminated with other neurological material capable of causing harm, and the shift to non-neural cell cultures resolved these problems and opened the path to the production of vaccine on the scale that a mass trial would require. Salk's process involved growing each of the three virus types in the newly available cell cultures, harvesting and concentrating the viral material, treating it with carefully calibrated concentrations of formaldehyde over carefully calibrated periods of time to inactivate the virus without destroying the antigenic proteins, and then testing each batch exhaustively to confirm that inactivation was complete and that no live virus remained in the final preparation, a step that was not merely technically demanding, but was also, given the nature of what was being produced, morally imperative, because a vaccine that contained residual live virus would be capable of causing the disease it was intended to prevent. The testing protocols developed by Salk and his team, the procedures for confirming complete inactivation, for verifying potency, for standardizing the preparation from batch to batch, constituted a body of methodological knowledge that was not only essential to their own vaccine program, but that would eventually contribute to the broader field of vaccine development and production. Through the early 1950s, Salk tested preliminary versions of his vaccine, first in small groups of already immune children, then in groups of children who had not previously been exposed to the virus, monitoring carefully for immune response and for safety, and the results of these early trials, while conducted at too small a scale to draw definitive conclusions about efficacy, were encouraging enough to support the case for proceeding to the large-scale field trial that would be needed to answer the questions that only a mass trial could answer. The paper documentation of these early trials, the typed case reports, and the laboratory notebooks, and the correspondence with the National Foundation's medical advisors, accumulated in the files of the Pittsburgh Laboratory and in the offices of the Foundation in New York, building the evidentiary record of a scientific process that was moving, with deliberate care, toward a moment of decision. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, under the leadership of Basil O'Connor, who had succeeded Roosevelt as its driving force, and who brought to the role a lawyer's precision and an administrator's organizational capacity, made the decision in the early 1950s to plan for a large-scale field trial of Salk's vaccine that would be unprecedented in the history of vaccine testing in America, both in its geographical scope and in the number of children it would involve. The trial was designed by Thomas Francis Jr., who was Salk's former mentor from their influenza research days, and who had been selected to lead the evaluation committee, precisely because of his methodological rigor and his independence from the vaccine's development. And the design Francis proposed was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in which children who were to receive the vaccine would be matched with children who received an inert placebo, and in which neither the physicians administering the injections nor the children and families receiving them would know which preparation was which, ensuring that the subsequent assessment of outcomes would be free from the influence of expectation or hope. The scale of the trial that was eventually conducted in the spring of 1954 was genuinely remarkable. Nearly 8 million American children participated, drawn from 44 states. And the children who participated in the placebo-controlled portion of the trial numbered approximately 650,000, making it the largest clinical trial in American history at that time, a logistical undertaking that required the coordination of hundreds of thousands of physicians, nurses, school administrators, and volunteers across the country, all of them working toward a single defined purpose. The children who participated in the trial were given the name Polio Pioneers, a name that acknowledged the genuine significance of their participation, and that carried within it a particular kind of civic pride, the recognition that these children and their families were contributing something real and tangible to a collective effort of national importance. The spring of 1954, the season of the trial, had its own particular atmosphere in the communities where the injections were given, the school gymnasiums and the community halls where the children lined up with their parents' signed permission forms, the quiet efficiency of the medical teams working through the lines, the particular courage of the children who rolled up their sleeves and held still while the needle went in, each one adding their small contribution to the accumulating statistical fabric from which the answer to the great question would eventually be woven. Thomas Francis and his team at the University of Michigan spent the months following the trial collecting and analyzing the data, a process that required enormous computational effort by the standards of the mid-1950s, and that was conducted with a thoroughness and a confidentiality that kept the results from being known until the formal announcement was ready. The morning of April 12, 1955 arrived with a particular quality of expectation that had been building for months because the scientific community and the public health community, and indeed, a very large portion of the American public knew that Thomas Francis was going to announce the results of the Salk vaccine trial that day, and knew that whatever he said would be significant, but did not know what he was going to say. The announcement was made at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, in Rackham Auditorium, before an audience of scientists and physicians and journalists and representatives of the National Foundation, and Francis presented the data with the measured precision of a man who had spent months ensuring that every number he was about to report was correct and defensible, and the numbers he reported were these. The Salk vaccine was safe. The Salk vaccine was potent, and the Salk vaccines was 80 to 90% effective in preventing paralytic poliomyelitis. The response to this announcement was unlike almost any other response to a scientific finding in American history, because the finding in question was not an abstract matter of academic interest, but something that touched the lives of families across the country, something that meant that the summer dread, the watchfulness of parents, the rows of iron lungs in the hospital wards, the blue and white placards, and the quarantined households, and the closed swimming pools, all of that had a potential end in view, that the specific fear that had defined American summers for a generation was capable of being answered. April 12th, 1955 was, with a particular fitness that was noted at the time, the 10th anniversary of the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had died on April 12th, 1945 at his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage, and who had not lived to see the vaccine that the organization he helped to found would ultimately make possible. Church bells rang in some towns when the announcement came over the radio, and celebrations broke out in others, and in the hospitals where patients still lay in iron lungs. The nurses told their patients the news, and the patients wept, not from sadness, but from something more complicated and more quiet. The particular emotion of people who have lived for years in the shadow of a thing and who hear for the first time that the shadow is lifting. The weeks and months following the announcement of April 12, 1955, brought with them the beginning of the process of translating the scientific finding into a public health reality, which meant manufacturing the vaccine at sufficient scale to supply the National Immunization Program that the federal government and the National Foundation had been planning. And this process, which should have been straightforward given the years of preparation that had preceded it, encountered, within weeks of the announcement, a setback that was devastating in its implications and that very nearly derailed the entire vaccination program before it could reach the children it was intended to protect. The Cutter incident, as it came to be known, began in late April 1955, when reports began to emerge from California and Idaho of children who had developed paralytic polio after receiving lots of Salk vaccine produced by Cutter Laboratories, one of the pharmaceutical companies licensed to manufacture the vaccine. Investigation revealed that the Cutter vaccine lots in question contained residual live polio virus that had not been completely inactivated, a failure in the manufacturing process that resulted in some 220,000 children being injected with vaccine that contained live virus, of whom approximately 70,000 developed a mild form of the disease. 164 were severely paralyzed and 10 died. The Cutter incident created, in the spring of 1955, a crisis that required the federal government to act quickly and decisively, both to halt the distribution of the affected vaccine lots and to investigate the manufacturing processes at Cutter and at the other licensed manufacturers. And the response included the temporary suspension of the vaccination program while the investigation proceeded. And new quality control protocols were developed and implemented. Surgeon General Leonard Scheel oversaw the investigation and the subsequent tightening of manufacturing standards, and within weeks, the program was resumed with vaccine from manufacturers whose processes had been verified to meet the new and more stringent requirements. But the damage to public confidence had been done, and the pace of vaccination in the months following the Qatar incident was slower than it would otherwise have been, a delay that was measured not merely in administrative terms, but in the number of children who remained unvaccinated through the summer of 1955, and who were therefore still at risk. The investigation of the Qatar incident produced, as one of its most lasting contributions, a set of principles for vaccine safety testing and manufacturing oversight that became the foundation of the regulatory framework governing vaccine production in the United States in the decades that followed. A framework built on the premise that the safety of a vaccine was not a matter that could be left entirely to the judgment of the manufacturers, but required independent verification and ongoing regulatory scrutiny. And yet, despite the disruption and the sorrow of the Qatar episode, the fundamental finding of the 1954 trial stood. The Salk vaccine was safe when properly manufactured and effective against all three types of poliovirus, and the program of national vaccination moved forward through 1955 and into 1956 and beyond, with the number of children receiving the vaccine growing each month and the number of new polio cases beginning, for the first time in the epidemic era, to show a sustained and meaningful decline. The decline in polio cases that followed the widespread introduction of the Salk vaccine was measurable and significant, though it unfolded not as a sudden disappearance, but as a gradual ebbing, a slow withdrawal of the epidemic tide that had risen so dramatically in the first half of the 20th century. In 1952, the worst year of the epidemic, more than 57,000 cases had been reported. But by 1957, 2 years into the mass vaccination program, the number of reported cases had fallen to approximately 5,600, a reduction of more than 90% from the epidemic peak, and the trend continued downward through the late 1950s as the proportion of the population covered by vaccination increased. The iron lungs that had filled the hospital wards in the early 1950s began, not immediately but over time, to be needed less urgently, and the particular atmosphere of the polio ward, the rhythm of the machines, and the rows of cylinders, and the particular courage of the patients within them became something that new generations of medical students would read about in textbooks, rather than encounter in their clinical training, a transition that was gradual and real, and that represented, in its quiet way, one of the significant achievements of 20th century medicine. Albert Sabin, whose live attenuated oral vaccines had been in development throughout the years of Salk's work, and who had persisted in his belief that a live virus vaccine offered advantages over the killed virus approach, conducted large-scale field trials of his own vaccine in the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1957, trials involving tens of millions of children, and the results were sufficiently positive to support the eventual licensure of the oral vaccine in the United States in 1961. The Sabin oral vaccine, which could be administered on a sugar cube rather than by injection, and which produced intestinal immunity in addition to blood-level antibodies, became, through the 1960s, the preferred vaccine for most of the world, partly because of its ease of administration, and partly because of its capacity to interrupt transmission in the gut, and thus contribute to the broader eradication of the disease, rather than merely to the prevention of paralysis in vaccinated individuals. The two vaccines, Salk's killed virus injectable preparation and Sabin's live attenuated oral preparation, represented two distinct approaches to the same problem, and two distinct personalities in the history of polio research. and the relationship between their creators was never fully free of the tension and the rivalry that had characterized the polio research community during the years of development, a tension that belonged to the particular human texture of scientific competition, and that was, in some ways, separate from the larger story of the disease's defeat. Over the next several decades, through national vaccination programs and through the international campaigns organized under the auspices of the World Health Organization and UNICEF and the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the disease that had paralyzed children in ancient Egypt and swept through the tenements of Brooklyn in 1916 and laid Franklin Roosevelt low on a Canadian island in 1921 was pushed back, continent by continent, year by year, to the very margins of its former territory, its presence reduced to a small number of remaining endemic regions, its power diminished to a fraction of what it had once been, the long arc of its history bending, slowly and with effort, and with the collective will of many nations and many individuals, towards something that looked, in its broad outlines, like the possibility of an end. And so here, in the quiet space of this long and patient telling, we have travelled from the carved stone of ancient Egypt to the warm pools of Georgia, from the tenements of Brooklyn in 1916 to the auditorium in Ann Arbor in 1955, from the first isolation of a virus in a Viennese laboratory to the mass vaccination of nearly 2 million children on a spring morning in America. And what the story reveals, if we hold it at a slight distance and allow its shape to emerge from the details, is the long and slow process by which human beings come to understand a thing that has been present among them for thousands of years, and to marshal, eventually, the knowledge and the resources and the collective will to respond to it. It is a story without a single hero, though it has many significant figures, and without a single turning point, though it has many decisive moments. And it is, in its fullest telling, a story about the ordinary and extraordinary work of many people across many generations who sat in laboratories and clinics and hospital wards and fundraising meetings and contributed, each in their particular way, to the accumulation of understanding and the building of capacity that made the vaccines possible and the eradication campaign viable. Jonas Salk, when asked in a famous television interview whether he had patented the vaccine he had developed, replied that there was no patent, that the people had funded the research through the march of dimes, and the vaccine belonged to the people, a response that was both practically accurate and philosophically significant, a statement about the collective nature of the achievement, that the polished surfaces of individual biography can sometimes obscure. The iron lungs that once filled the wards of children's hospitals still exist, some of them in museums and in the homes of a very few remaining long-term users. And they stand as a particular kind of memorial, not to failure, but to the particular courage of the era. Before the vaccine, the courage of the patients and the families and the medical workers who managed, within the constraints of what was possible in their time, to live and to hope and to continue. And here, in the dark and quiet room where you have been listening, in the soft space between wakefulness and sleep, the history settles gently around you, like the warmth of a spring in Georgia, like the slow and certain rhythm of breath moving in and out, like the knowledge that the long and patient work of many lives has left the world, in this particular way and in others, a little safer than it found it, and that you are resting tonight in the accumulated shelter of all of that effort, breathing slowly, letting the past drift away, safe and still and gradually, gently at peace. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which was launched formally in 1988 through a resolution of the World Health Assembly, represented something that had very few precedents in the history of international public health, a coordinated commitment by the nations of the world to pursue not merely the control of a disease, but its complete elimination from the human population, a goal that had been achieved only once before in recorded history, with the eradication of smallpox in 1980. And that required, in the case of polio, a scale of organizational effort and a degree of international cooperation that stretched across political boundaries and ideological differences and the considerable logistical challenges of reaching children in some of the most remote and underserved communities on Earth. The resolution that established the initiative set the year 2000 as its target for eradication, a target that proved, in the event, to be optimistic, as the disease proved more resilient in certain regions than the initial projections had anticipated, but which served nonetheless as a focusing aspiration, a shared commitment that kept the partners in the initiative oriented toward a common purpose through the years of difficulty and partial progress that followed. The partners in the initiative were 4 in number at its founding: the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Rotary International, which had been running its own polio immunization program called Polio Plus since 1985, and which brought to the initiative a network of local civic clubs and volunteer capacity in communities around the world that no government agency could easily replicate. The decision to pursue eradication rather than control was not universally embraced within the public health community, because eradication is an all-or-nothing proposition that requires achieving and maintaining very high levels of vaccine coverage in every corner of every country, and the resources and attention devoted to eradication are resources and attention that cannot simultaneously be devoted to other health priorities, a trade-off that some public health economists and practitioners found difficult to justify, given the many competing demands on limited global health budgets. But the advocates of eradication made their case on both moral and practical grounds, arguing that a disease capable of causing paralysis in tens of thousands of children each year was a moral priority that justified the investment, and that the long-term savings from eliminating the disease entirely would far exceed the costs of the eradication campaign, because a world without polio would be a world that no longer needed to vaccinate against polio, and the cumulative savings of that cessation would compound across generations. The logistical architecture of the eradication campaign, the national immunization days on which teams of vaccinators moved through entire countries administering the oral polio vaccine to every child under 5 regardless of prior vaccination status. The surveillance networks that tracked cases of acute flaccid paralysis to detect the virus's continued presence. The cold chain systems that maintained the temperature-sensitive oral vaccine from manufacture to the moment of administration in village, health posts, and house-to-house visits in the most challenging environments on Earth. All of this constituted one of the largest sustained public health operations in human history, involving millions of volunteers and health workers and untold quantities of organizational effort across more than 125 countries. In 1988, the year the initiative began, there were an estimated 350,000 cases of polio each year in 125 endemic countries, and the sound of children crying in vaccination lines and the patient movement of health workers through remote communities and the slow, careful work of surveillance officers. Interviewing parents about paralyzed children was the daily texture of a campaign that measured its progress in fractions of a percentage point of coverage, and in the absence of cases, in regions that had last reported them months or years before. The progress of the eradication campaign through the 1990s was remarkable by any reasonable measure, even as it fell short of the year 2000 target that had been set with more optimism than the epidemiological reality would ultimately support. The Americas were certified polio-free in 1994, following the last wild poliovirus case in the Western Hemisphere, which occurred in Junín, Peru, in August 1991 in a child named Luis Fermín Tenorio Cortés, whose name entered the historical record as the last person in the Americas to be paralyzed by wild poliovirus, a distinction both sorrowful and historically significant because his was the last case in a region that had once carried a significant burden of the disease and that had achieved through sustained vaccination effort a state of freedom from it that would endure. The Western Pacific region was certified polio-free in 2000, followed by the European region in 2002. And these certifications represented genuine and hard-won achievements, the product of years of national immunization days and house-to-house vaccination campaigns, and the patient work of surveillance systems that had to be sensitive enough to detect the virus's presence, even in its absence. Because the criteria for certification required not merely the absence of reported cases, but the demonstration that the surveillance systems in place were capable of detecting a case if one occurred, a standard that required both epidemiological and laboratory capacity at a level that many countries had to build, with international support from very modest beginnings. The regions that proved most resistant to eradication were those where the combination of political instability, inadequate health infrastructure, vaccine hesitancy in certain communities, and the particular environmental conditions that favored the virus's circulation created barriers that no single strategy could fully overcome. And the most persistent of these challenges were concentrated in what came to be called the final reservoirs of wild poliovirus, the regions of northern Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, where the virus maintained its circulation longest, and from which, in the years of incomplete coverage, it periodically spread to neighboring countries and regions that had previously been free of it. Nigeria's experience with polio eradication was particularly complex because in 2003, Islamic leaders in the northern states of Kano, Zamfara, and Kaduna announced a boycott of the polio vaccination campaign based on concerns, which were not supported by scientific evidence, that the vaccine had been contaminated with anti-fertility agents or with the HIV virus. Concerns that reflected both genuine distrust of Western-led public health interventions and the particular political dynamics of a region with complex relationships to the federal government and to international agencies. The boycott lasted approximately a year before it was resolved through a combination of diplomatic engagement, the use of vaccine produced in Indonesia that carried a different provenance and could not be associated with Western pharmaceutical companies, and the involvement of respected Islamic medical authorities who endorsed the vaccine's safety and the importance of protecting children from paralysis. But the period of reduced vaccination coverage had allowed the virus to spread, and by 2004, Nigeria's polio virus had reinfected more than 20 countries in Africa and Asia, that had previously been free of it, a setback that required years of additional effort and resources to address, and that illustrated, with painful clarity, the fragility of eradication progress in the absence of universal and sustained coverage. The outdoor heat of the northern Nigerian Sahel, the crowded markets of Kano, the sound of children playing in the dust of village squares, the patient figures of health workers moving from compound to compound with their vaccines and their marking pens and their tally sheets. All of this was the landscape of a campaign that was conducted in the gap between scientific possibility and social reality, between what the vaccine could do when administered and what the complex human world sometimes prevented it from doing. In Pakistan and Afghanistan, the challenges to polio eradication took on dimensions that were shaped by the particular political and military history of those two countries, and by the unique circumstances of the region that straddles their border, the tribal areas of Pakistan's northwest, and the provinces of eastern Afghanistan where the Taliban movement had originated, and where its governance, or the absence of governance, created conditions in which the routine delivery of health services was fundamentally disrupted, and in which the polio vaccination campaign carried risks for the workers who conducted it that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of working in remote or impoverished communities. The association of the CIA with a fake hepatitis B vaccination campaign in Abbottabad in 2011, conducted as part of the intelligence operation that located Osama bin Laden, had a devastating effect on public trust in vaccination programs in Pakistan and contributed to a climate of suspicion in which polio vaccinators were, on multiple occasions in the years that followed, the targets of violence from militant groups that portrayed the vaccination campaign as a cover for Western intelligence operations or as an attack on Muslim children. The killing of polio workers in Pakistan, which occurred repeatedly in the years between 2012 and the late 2010s, represented one of the darkest chapters in the history of the eradication campaign, a chapter in which the people most directly engaged in protecting children from paralysis were themselves made the targets of violence, and the sorrow of that situation was compounded by the knowledge that each disruption to the vaccination campaign allowed the virus to circulate further and paralyze more children, creating a cycle in which the obstacles to eradication themselves generated the suffering that made eradication more urgently necessary. The Taliban's relationship with the polio vaccination campaign in Afghanistan was complicated and variable across time and across geography, with some Taliban commanders permitting vaccination in areas under their control and others prohibiting it. And the campaign in Afghanistan required constant negotiation with local power structures and constant adaptation to changing political and security conditions in ways that stretched the capacity of the organizations responsible for its delivery. Nevertheless, through all of these difficulties, the eradication campaign continued, and the number of wild poliovirus cases globally fell, year by year, from the hundreds of thousands of the late 1980s to the thousands of the late 1990s to the hundreds of the mid-2000s to the low tens by the mid-2010s, a decline that was steep and sustained, even if it stopped short of the final zero that eradication required. The particular courage of the health workers who continued to conduct vaccination campaigns in these difficult environments, the women in Pakistan who went house to house with their vaccines in communities, where their presence was not always welcome, the surveillance officers who traveled to remote villages to investigate reports of paralyzed children, the laboratory workers who processed stool samples, and identified virus types. All of this was the human substance of a campaign that appeared in its aggregate statistics as a simple line on a graph trending downward towards zero. The science of poliovirus was itself continuing to develop through the years of the eradication campaign and the accumulated knowledge of the virus's biology, its genetic structure, its mechanisms of pathogenesis and transmission grew substantially richer as molecular techniques became available that allowed researchers to analyze viral sequences and trace the geographic movement of specific viral lineages with a precision that had not been possible in earlier decades. The discovery that wild poliovirus existed in 3 distinct serotypes, types 1, 2, and 3, each requiring representation in a complete vaccine, had been made in the 1940s. But the eradication campaign's ongoing surveillance revealed that these types did not respond equally to vaccination pressure, and that type 2 wild poliovirus was the first to succumb, with the last known case of wild type 2 poliovirus occurring in India in 1999, and the serotype being declared eradicated globally in 2015. A milestone that allowed for the reformulation of the oral vaccine to remove the type 2 component in 2016. Wild poliovirus type 3 was declared eradicated in 2019, leaving only type 1 as the remaining wild poliovirus in circulation, confined to the final reservoirs in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this progressive narrowing of the viral landscape represented a genuine and hard-won scientific achievement, the product of decades of vaccination and surveillance, and the patient tracking of viral genetics in laboratories around the world. But the eradication campaign also encountered, through these years, a challenge that had not been fully anticipated in the original strategic planning, which was the emergence of vaccine-derived polioviruses, strains of poliovirus that had originated from the live attenuated oral vaccine itself, and that had, through the process of replication in under-vaccinated communities, regained something approaching their original virulence and their capacity to cause paralytic disease in susceptible individuals. The oral vaccine virus, in its live attenuated form, replicates in the intestinal tract of vaccinated children and can spread to unvaccinated individuals in the community, which is, under conditions of high vaccination coverage, a beneficial phenomenon because it extends the immunizing effect of the vaccine beyond those who were directly vaccinated, but which becomes a problem in communities where vaccination coverage is low because in those communities the vaccine virus can circulate for extended periods, accumulating genetic changes that gradually reverse the attenuation and produce a strain that behaves more like wild virus than like vaccine. These vaccine-derived polioviruses, particularly the type 2, circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus that emerged after the withdrawal of the type 2 component from the oral vaccine in 2016, became, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, a significant complication for the eradication campaign, with outbreaks of vaccine-derived polio occurring in numerous African countries and in parts of Asia, outbreaks that required the deployment of novel vaccines, specifically the novel oral polio vaccine, type 2, which had been designed with additional genetic stability to reduce the risk of reversion. The interplay between wild poliovirus eradication and the management of vaccine-derived poliovirus outbreaks gave the final phase of the eradication campaign a complexity that the original architects of the initiative had not fully foreseen, and that required ongoing adaptation of strategy and ongoing investment in surveillance and response capacity, even as the wild virus retreated to its final strongholds. India's certification as polio-free in 2014 represented one of the most significant single milestones in the history of the eradication campaign, because India had been, for most of the campaign's duration, the country with the highest burden of polio cases. A country of more than 1 billion people with an extraordinarily complex vaccination challenge posed by its diversity of languages and cultures, and the density of its most severely affected populations in the Gangetic plains of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where environmental conditions, including high rates of other enteric infections, reduce the efficacy of the oral vaccine, and where the logistics of reaching every child required an organizational effort of staggering scale. The last case of wild poliovirus in India was recorded on January 13, 2011, in a 2-year-old girl named Rukhsar Khatun in the village of Pachigata in West Bengal, and her name, like the name of Luis Fermin Tenorio Cortez in Peru 2 decades earlier, entered the historical record as a specific and human marker of a geographic achievement, the last known paralysis caused by wild poliovirus in a country that had seemed, for much of the eradication campaign, among the most difficult in which to achieve that goal. The achievement in India was the result of years of national immunization days, on which hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine were administered in a single day, of house-to-house vaccination drives in the dense urban slums of Mumbai and Kolkata, and the rural villages of the Gangetic Plains, of the extraordinary logistical effort required to maintain the cold chain for oral vaccine in a country of India's size and climatic diversity, and of the sustained commitment of the Indian government and the state health systems, and the thousands of frontline health workers who went door to door in the heat and the monsoon rains with their vaccine and their tally sheets and their determination. The certification of India as polio-free was announced by the World Health Organization in March 2014, and the moment was greeted in India with a quiet satisfaction that reflected both the scale of what had been achieved and the memory of how far the country had traveled to reach it. The Southeast Asia region as a whole was certified polio-free in March 2014, leaving the African region and the Eastern Mediterranean region as the remaining areas of active transmission, with the African region achieving certification of wild poliovirus eradication in August 2020, a milestone that reduced the geographic range of the wild virus to the single remaining endemic zone straddling the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. The soft sound of a child receiving a vaccine, the bright color of the ink marking a child's finger to indicate recent vaccination, the quiet efficiency of a vaccination team moving through a village. All of these small and unglamorous scenes were the building blocks of an achievement that, when its cumulative effect is considered, represents one of the more profound acts of collective human purpose in the history of medicine. The story of polio and the human body's encounter with it is, at its deepest level, a story about a very small thing and a very large response, about a virus so tiny it cannot be seen with an ordinary microscope, carrying within its protein shell a strand of genetic material that contains the instructions for its own replication, and nothing more, encountering the vastly complex machinery of the human immune system, and, in a small fraction of cases, slipping past that machinery and reaching the motor neurons of the spinal cord, where the damage it causes is irreversible, where the silence it leaves behind in the muscles is permanent. The poliovirus particle itself is a thing of a certain austere beauty, if one is inclined to think about it in that way. A small sphere of protein 27 nanometers in diameter, smaller than the wavelength of visible light. Composed of 60 copies, each of 4 distinct proteins arranged in a precise icosahedral symmetry that has been mapped in detail by crystallographers using the techniques of X-ray diffraction. A structure that is both elegant in its regularity and ruthless in its function. The function of that structure, the binding of the viral particle to a specific receptor on the surface of human cells, the injection of the viral RNA into the cell, the hijacking of the cell's own protein synthesis machinery to produce new viral particles, the rupture of the cell, and the release of those particles into the surrounding tissue is a sequence that has no intention behind it and no purpose beyond its own continuation. And yet, it's a sequence that has shaped the lives of tens of millions of human beings across the centuries, and that has, by shaping those lives, shaped the history of medicine and public health and the social organization of communities in ways that extend far beyond the biology of infection. The understanding of how the virus does, what it does accumulated over the second half of the 20th century, through the work of structural biologists and molecular virologists and biochemists working in laboratories across the world, building protein by protein and interaction by interaction, a detailed picture of the molecular events through which a 27 nanometer particle can, in a fraction of cases, paralyze a human being. This knowledge, precise and technical as it is, has contributed to the ongoing work of ensuring that the vaccines in use today remain effective against any variants of the virus that might arise, and to the development of antiviral compounds that might one day provide a therapeutic option for those exposed to the virus in the post-eradication era, though the prospect of eradication itself makes the long-term utility of such compounds a matter of diminishing practical relevance. The particular quality of scientific knowledge about the polio virus, the way in which the detailed molecular understanding now available contrasts with the complete ignorance of even its viral nature that prevailed until 1908, is itself a measure of the distance traveled in a little over a century of biological research, a distance that spans from Landsteiner's filtration experiments in Vienna to the high-resolution cryo-electron microscopy, images of viral particles produced in contemporary structural biology laboratories. The lives of those who experienced paralytic polio, the children and adults who survived the acute phase of the disease and lived on in bodies altered by the virus, constitute a particular and important strand of the polio story that sits alongside the narratives of scientific discovery and public health achievement, and that deserves its own careful attention. Because the experience of living with polio and its aftermath shaped not only individual lives but the broader cultural and social understanding of disability in the 20th century, in ways that had consequences extending far beyond disease itself. The post-polio experience was, and for many survivors remains, a complex and multidimensional one, shaped in the first instance by the nature and extent of the paralysis, by whether the affected muscles recovered partially, substantially, or not at all, and by the quality of the rehabilitation available in the years following the acute illness, which varied enormously across time and geography and socioeconomic circumstance. Physical therapists and occupational therapists who worked with polio survivors during the epidemic years developed approaches to rehabilitation that emphasized the training of remaining muscle function to compensate for lost function, the use of braces and assistive devices to maximize mobility, and the social and psychological dimensions of adjustment to disability. And the principles developed in those years became foundational to the broader field of physical medicine and rehabilitation. As it developed through the second half of the 20th century, the Warm Springs model, which Roosevelt had established in the late 1920s, and which continued to operate through the epidemic years as both a treatment center and a research and training facility, was influential in establishing rehabilitation as a medical specialty with its own body of knowledge and its own standards of practice. And the physicians and therapists trained at Warm Springs carried what they learned there to hospitals and rehabilitation centers across the country. Many polio survivors became, through the experience of managing their disability and navigating a world not designed for those with limited mobility, significant contributors to the disability rights movement that grew in strength through the 1970s and 1980s, and that culminated in the United States in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, a piece of legislation whose advocates included many individuals whose own experience of disability had been shaped, in whole or in part, by polio. The recognition that disability is not a tragedy to be overcome, but a dimension of human experience that demands accommodation and respect, a recognition that now underpins the legal and ethical frameworks of disability policy in many countries, was shaped in part by the particular experience of the polio generation who had lived through the epidemic years with their particular combination of medical care and social stigma, and had emerged with a collective wisdom about what it meant to live fully in a body that the world did not always make easy to inhabit. The phenomenon known as post-polio syndrome, which was not formally recognized as a distinct medical entity until the early 1980s, introduced a new dimension of complexity into the long-term experience of polio survivors, because it revealed that the effects of the original infection were not necessarily stable and completed, but could, decades later, produce new or worsening symptoms in individuals who had previously achieved a level of function and stability that they had reason to regard as permanent. Post-polio syndrome is characterized by the development, typically 30 to 40 years after the original polio infection, of new muscle weakness, fatigue, and pain in individuals who had previously stabilized after their acute illness, and the underlying mechanism as it came to be understood by researchers, including Dr. Lauro Halstead at the National Rehabilitation Hospital in Washington, appears to involve the gradual failure of the enlarged motor neurons that had compensated for the neurons destroyed by the original infection, neurons that had been doing more than their original share of work for decades, and that eventually begin to show the wear of that sustained extra effort. The first formal conference on post-polio syndrome was held in 1984 at Warm Springs, the facility that had begun as Roosevelt's Rehabilitation Center, and that continued 6 decades after its founding to be a place of particular significance in the polio story. And the gathering of survivors and clinicians at that conference represented an important moment of recognition, a moment in which a community of people who had been managing their own unexplained new symptoms in isolation found themselves acknowledged and studied and brought together as a defined clinical population. Estimates of the number of polio survivors worldwide who developed post-polio syndrome varied, but most studies suggested that between 25 and 40% of those who had experienced significant paralytic polio would eventually develop some degree of post-polio syndrome symptoms, a proportion that, applied to the global population of polio survivors, represented hundreds of thousands of individuals experiencing new disability decades after they had believed their recovery to be complete. The management of post-polio syndrome became, through the 1990s and 2000s, an important area of clinical practice for rehabilitation medicine specialists, with approaches emphasizing energy conservation, appropriate use of assistive devices, and the careful calibration of exercise to strengthen muscles without overworking the already stressed motor units. And the growing body of clinical knowledge about post-polio syndrome contributed to a broader understanding of the long-term consequences of viral infections of the nervous system. The community of post-polio syndrome patients, many of them people who had been children during the epidemic years, and who had built adult lives of considerable achievement and independence, found in their shared experience of new symptoms a renewed solidarity and a renewed connection to the broader history of the disease from which they had never, in the most precise biological sense, fully separated. The question of what the history of polio teaches about the possibilities and the limits of public health, and about the relationship between scientific knowledge and collective action, and the organization of political will, is one that those who have studied the disease's long arc tend to approach with a combination of genuine admiration and appropriate caution. The admiration belongs to what was achieved. A disease that paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children each year, that filled hospital wards with iron lungs and reshaped the childhood summers of an entire generation, was reduced through the development and deployment of effective vaccines, and through decades of sustained international cooperation to a small fraction of its former scale, and may yet, with continued effort, be brought to the final elimination that the Global Polio Eradication Initiative has pursued since 1988. The caution belongs to what the polio story also reveals about the fragility of public health achievements, about how quickly progress can be reversed by the withdrawal of political commitment, or the erosion of public trust, or the disruption of the organizational systems on which vaccination campaigns depend, about how a disease that was eliminated from the Americas in 1991 and from Europe in 200 to and from India in 2011 can still, in 2026, persist in the tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan and generate vaccine-derived outbreaks in communities with inadequate vaccination coverage across multiple continents. The parallel between the challenges of the polio eradication campaign and the challenges of other major global health initiatives, between the hesitancy that disrupted vaccination in northern Nigeria in 2003 and the hesitancy that surrounded various vaccines in various contexts in subsequent decades, is one that public health practitioners and historians draw with a certain careful regularity, not to establish a simple equivalence between different situations, but to recognize the recurring pattern of the social and political dimensions of vaccination as a public health intervention, dimensions that cannot be resolved by scientific evidence alone, and that require the kinds of community engagement and trust building and political negotiation that belong to a different vocabulary than the one in which vaccines and their efficacy are described. The history of polio is, in this sense, not merely a story about a virus and its defeat, but a story about how societies make decisions, about collective action in the face of individual risk, about who bears the costs, and who receives the benefits of public health programs, about the relationship between individual autonomy and collective welfare that underlies all of public health. And that becomes most visible and most contested in the context of mass vaccination. The particular history of the March of Dimes, The voluntary mass fundraising campaign through which ordinary Americans contributed to the research that produced the Salk vaccine represents one answer to the question of how democratic societies mobilize resources for collective health challenges, an answer that relied on the particular conjunction of an emotionally resonant cause, a charismatic leader whose own body embodied the disease in question, and a fundraising mechanism simple enough to invite participation from every household regardless of means. The cultural presence of polio in the literature and art and memory of the 20th century reflects the depth of the disease's imprint on the societies it touched most severely. And the works that polio has generated, from the medical memoirs and the journalistic accounts, to the novels and films and personal testimonies of survivors, constitute a body of material through which the experience of the epidemic can be approached from a different angle than the epidemiological and scientific perspectives that dominate the formal history of the disease. Philip Roth's novel Nemesis, published in 2010, is set during the Newark polio epidemic of the summer of 1944 and follows a young playground director named Bucky Cantor through a summer of escalating fear and loss. And it is considered by many literary critics among the most thoughtful fictional explorations of what the epidemic felt like from the inside, from the perspective of a young man, watching children he was responsible for fall, ill and trying, without the knowledge or the tools to do so effectively, to make sense of what was happening around him. The memoir literature produced by polio survivors, including the accounts of those who spent extended periods in iron lungs and those who regained partial function through rehabilitation, and those who went on to live lives of great professional and personal achievement, despite persistent disability, forms a particular genre of witness testimony that sits in a complex relationship to the formal medical history of the disease, neither confirming nor contradicting it, but adding to it a dimension of subjective experience that statistics and case reports cannot provide. The photographs of the polio era, the images of children in iron lungs and on crutches, and in the distinctive leg braces of the mid-20th century, the pictures of vaccination lines in 1954, and of parents watching their children receive the Salk vaccine with expressions that combined hope and anxiety in roughly equal measure, constitute a visual archive of the epidemic that continues to be reproduced and referenced in contemporary discussions of public health and vaccination, carrying across the decades an immediacy that more recent images of more recent outbreaks have not entirely displaced. Franklin Roosevelt's own representation in American culture, the complex negotiation of his disability in his public image, and in the iconography of his presidency, the famous photographs taken by careful agreement with the press corps that showed him standing or seated, but rarely in his wheelchair, and the subsequent re-examination of that negotiation by historians and disability studies, scholars who have raised important questions about what it meant and what it cost. All of this belongs to the cultural history of polio in a way that illuminates both the particular attitudes toward disability in mid-20th century America and the ways in which the public meaning of illness and physical difference is always constructed and contested rather than simply given. The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, dedicated in 1997, includes a statue of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, a decision that was the subject of significant debate and that represented, in its eventual outcome, a particular moment in the evolving relationship between American culture and the memory of disability, a moment in which the decision was made to represent the president as he actually was, rather than as he had chosen to present himself, a decision that some disability advocates celebrated as a recognition of the dignity and full humanity of disabled people, and that others saw as a posthumous violation of Roosevelt's own carefully managed self-presentation. The question of what polio leaves behind, not in the bodies of survivors, or in the pages of medical journals, or in the organizational structures of public health, but in the deeper and quieter layers of collective memory, is one that cannot be answered with the same precision as the scientific and epidemiological questions that the disease's history raises, because collective memory is a more elusive and more variable thing than a vaccination rate or a case count, shaped by the particular ways in which different generations transmit their experiences to those who did not share them. For the generation that grew up during the epidemic years, the children of the 1940s and early 1950s, who knew the summer dread from the inside, and who watched their peers disappear into hospital wards and emerge, sometimes altered. The memory of polio has the character of a formative experience, something that shaped the understanding of vulnerability and contingency and the limits of control that they carried into adult life, and that informed in ways both direct and indirect the attitudes toward health and medicine and public health that they passed on to their children. For the generation that grew up after the vaccine, the children of the late 1950s and 1960s, who received the Salk or Sabin vaccine as a routine part of childhood without knowing, in most cases, precisely what they were being protected from, polio exists as a more abstract historical reference, something known about rather than known, present in the background of the cultural understanding of 20th century America, but not felt as a personal or familial memory in the same way that it was felt by those who were born earlier. The gradual passage of the epidemic generation, the diminishing number of people alive who have personal memory of the polio wards and the iron lungs, and the particular fear of the summer months, means that the disease is, in the early decades of the 21st century, in the process of transitioning from living memory to historical record, from something that some people remember to something that all people must be told, a transition that carries with it both the natural attrition of time and the particular responsibility of those who tell the story to tell it with enough fidelity to the human reality that something of its weight and its meaning survives the transition. The oral history projects and the museum exhibitions and the documentary films and the academic studies that have been devoted to preserving the memory of the polio epidemic in the years since the vaccine made it a historical rather than a current event constitute a collective effort of remembrance that serves purposes both retrospective and prospective, honoring the experience of those who lived through the epidemic and maintaining, for those who did not, the understanding of what is at stake when a preventable disease is allowed to circulate, what it costs in individual lives and in the collective texture of a society's summers, when the protection that vaccines can provide is withheld or refused or simply allowed to lapse. And so we arrive at last at this quiet moment, at the end of a very long telling, at the place where the story of polio, which began with a carving on a stone in ancient Egypt and wound through Vienna and New York and Warm Springs and Pittsburgh and Ann Arbor and the remote valleys of Pakistan, comes to rest in the present, in the world as it exists today, in which the wild polio virus circulates in only the smallest remnant of its former range, in which vaccines have protected billions of children from the paralysis that defined the disease for so many generations, and in which the work of final eradication continues. patient and demanding as it has always been, carried forward by the thousands of health workers and researchers and public health administrators who continue to do, in their own time and in their own way, the same work that Jonas Salk and Thomas Francis and Basil O'Connor and the volunteers of the March of Dimes did in theirs. The ancient virus, which has been present in human bodies since at least the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, which moved through the civilizations of the ancient and medieval world without accumulating into the great epidemics that would define it in the modern era, which found in the improving cities of the early 20th century a paradoxical new power which paralyzed a future president on a Canadian island in August 1921 and overwhelmed the hospitals of America in the summer of 1952 and filled the iron lungs of a generation of children who had done nothing to deserve what the small and indifferent virus had brought to them. The ancient virus is now reduced through human effort and human knowledge and the particular human capacity for collective purpose to the edges of its former territory, waiting, perhaps, for a lapse in the vigilance that has so reduced it, or perhaps, with continued effort and continued commitment, approaching the final silence that eradication would bring. The iron lung, that strange and necessary machine, that metal cylinder in which the breath of so many children was kept going by the rhythm of a bellows, while the rest of the world went about its ordinary business, stands now in museums and in the occasional documentary film as a memorial to a particular chapter in the history of medicine, a chapter in which the distance between what the disease could do and what medicine could offer was measured in the length of a metal cylinder and the sound of a machine breathing in the night. And you, who have travelled through all of this history tonight, through the ancient Egyptian stele and the tenements of Brooklyn and the warm pools of Georgia and the laboratories of Pittsburgh and the great international campaigns of the late 20th century, you have done so in the quietest possible way, resting, breathing, letting each chapter settle into the soft ground of approaching sleep. The past is very far away now, and the present is very still, and the room where you are resting is warm and safe. And the diseases that once defined entire summers and entire childhoods exist now in the careful custody of history, held there by the vaccines and the vigilance and the collective human effort that you have just, in your half-dreaming way, travelled through together. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the names and the dates drift gently past. Landsteiner and Salk and Roosevelt, 1908 and 1921 and 1955. The iron lung and the sugar cube and the March of Dimes. Let them drift as leaves, drift on water, unhurried and complete, belonging to the past where they have always belonged. While you remain here, in the present, in the warmth and the quiet, breathing slowly, resting,